He represents civil society organizations on behalf of the DAISY Consortium in the working group of the United Nations ESCAP committee that monitors implementation of the Incheon strategy in the Asia Pacific region. He is the designated focal person of DAISY Consortium for the training and technical support in capacity building programs of the Accessible Books Consortium of WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Mr. Monocha, after completion of postgraduate and research degrees from Delhi University, uh, left his PhD in the middle. I think his PhD was in the area of sociology, to work on his mission of providing information and content in accessible format to persons with print disability. During the past 2 decades of work as consultant or in honorary capacity, Mr. Monocha has managed or coordinated and has been a key contributor in several technological development or implementation projects that involve introduction of affordable technology solutions for persons with blindness and low vision to make them independent in educational, vocational, and daily living activities. Some of these technologies include smartphones with screen reading software in Indian languages, DAISY players with Indian languages, Smart Cane, Indo NVDA screen reading software, Sonic Labeler, and many more. Mr. Monocha is an Ashoka Fellow. He is the recipient of National Award, the IBN Super Idol Award, and the IM Lucknow Leadership Award. Thank you very much, Mr. Monocha, for taking of time from your busy schedule to address us all during this webinar. Over to you, Mr. Monocha.
Thank you so much, Professor Amit, for this opportunity and to be part of this center's initiative of addressing people and connecting with people on the area of assistive technology, which is obviously extremely dear to my heart and part of my mission in any case. So it's absolutely wonderful to be part of this initiative. And I hope that this initiative, what it says of bringing the global South together in this very, very important area, we are able to achieve that, and there is more collaboration that takes place within the developing countries for working out or getting the solutions and changing that scenario where most of the technologies or assistive technologies are either not compatible with our languages or not affordable at all. So I think we are there to trying to change that, and I think it's a big role that organizations like IIIT and this initiative of Microsoft and the Vision Empower has got a lot to play with this. Today, I think we are going to, I'm going to concentrate on certain key concepts of one being universal design and the second being the standards. Obviously in relevance to assistive technology. So the first thing that we need to actually acknowledge is that our society is actually having diversity. It's not a monolithic society. So there are, when we talk of this society, generally what happens is that we only think about people who are within this age group of 20 to 45, whose faculties are at its best, and they are beauty queens and Mr. Indias and the Mr. Worlds kind of people. But there are so many impairments and limitations that start creeping in either before the age of 15, 17 and after the age of 45. And within this age group of also, there are so many groups which would not have, which would have so many limitations and sensory limitations or physical limitations or mental capabilities limitations. And I'm not actually deliberately using the word disability because disabilities actually is a legal term that says that your functional limitations has to be um, either 40% or more to be qualified or to be labeled as a person with disability. However, when I talk of diversity, this obviously is would include people who would have even 5-10% of any kind of limitation or impairment that could creep in. And there are certain um, design considerations which are required for all of these that I'm talking about. So when we talk about um, uh, any technology, any product, any environment, while we are building it, the considerations to this fact has to be there that our society is made up of people with lots and lots of diversity. Um, we besides the physical and functional limitations of the human body, the diversity obviously does include language and economic and social diversities that we often talk about. Obviously, the diversity also includes the diversity of functional limitations of the human body. Now, the second part that this slide also brings about, the second key component here is that we want the society to be inclusive, which means that people with any kind of diversity is is actually included in the complete functioning of our society, the whole social structure, the whole economic and social activities that are going on in our society. We want those environments to be completely inclusive so that people with diversities are able to participate fully in them. That's the main aim. And the photograph that comes on this is actually related to acknowledging diversity in a classroom environment. So that's the example where it is there, where it's a mainstream school classroom, and there is a child with blindness who's sitting in this classroom with the rest of the people who are not blind. The mainstream school teacher is actually looking at peeping into this child's work. And the difference here is, the only difference which is happening is that this child is actually, this girl with blindness is actually using a laptop for her writing need. And this is an assignment that this teacher has given to the class. She is writing that assignment using a laptop. The rest of the people are writing the same assignment using the normal paper notebook, and the teacher is actually able to see what rest of the people are doing in that in on their copies, and is able to see on the screen of the laptop what this girl with blindness is actually writing here. This is an example of inclusion of people with diversity in the mainstream classroom. Obviously, there can be many more different diversities, and such kind of simple accommodations can help people to participate fully in the social or economic activity. So here what I will do, that I'll actually play a video. So what we are actually talking here about is universal design. So this is a slide which with the title universal design. So universal design actually means that the whatever we are designing has to be usable by all. We are not talking about separate products for taking care of diversities. We are saying that in terms of a product, if we talk about that, the same product is usable by all. And when we say that usable by all, doesn't mean that the product actually has to be usable by itself. What it means is that it allows people to use that same product with the assistive technology that they are habitual of using. So um, um, let me first play this. I'll just video. I'll switch on the audio of my computer and then I'll just play this video.
Putting the slot inside, jack inside, and I'm getting the welcome message. Now I'm selecting English, so I'll press 1. I don't need the louder volume, so I'll press enter to proceed. Now I have two options, either to hide or to display the screen, but when I don't want to display the screen, so I'm pressing 1. Now others cannot see what I'm doing. I'm just listening to the sound from my headphone, and that is what. I don't need orientation, so I will skip to that and I'll go to the actual transaction. Now it asks me to insert the card. I have a card. I'm just making sure that I'm in the right direction. There are some embossed numbers. I'm inserting the card. I've inserted and I'm taking it out. It's a dip card. So it asks me to press the pin, and I'm pressing enter. Now I don't want cash now. I'll go for balance inquiry. So I'll press 3. Now there are two options, types of account. Mine is a saving account, so I'll press 2. Now it says me that my balance is 500 rupees, and that is what exactly I wanted to know. The moment the transaction is over, I will remove the jack so that it will operate as a normal ATM ever after. So this is a completely accessible ATM, and the security measures have been taken care. I could see that nobody could notice what I have done.
Okay, so we were just witnessing an accessible ATM, which is fortunately a lot of these accessible ATMs are actually installed in our banks now, and a lot of these sites. What you would see normally in those ATMs is there is a headphone jack right there, and what it means is that as soon as you plug in a headphone in these ATMs, the operations and the instructions, the step-by-step movement actually changes. It changes to audio-centric operation of this ATM, and in a synthesized voice, it starts speaking all the commands, and all the inputs are taken in terms of the not from the touch screen, but it would give you, ask you like you would do on your IVR, various IVR operations through telephone. The input is asked from a keypad. You'll have to press 1 for 2, 1 for one option, 2 for the other option, and so on. So it keeps giving those options, and you are able to operate this ATM. And there was another beautiful example of that design, that the debit card itself, are created in a way that you can actually figure out which is the right side to go in, because it has got certain embossing on the sides, and the chip area is recognizable by touch. So these are all examples of good design, a true example of universal design, where you don't the specifications of the diversity has been acknowledged, that yes, there are going to be people who can't see the screen who are going to use the ATM, so they have added an audio card into it. We don't there is no separate ATM for the blind. It's there for everybody to use. When a person with blindness goes, they just plug in their our own technology, assistive technology. Here it's a very simple technology, which is just a headphone, and I can operate the same ATM. So this is one example, as I say, a true example of universal design, where the key principles which are there of the universal design, which you can see, are that there are no separate products. It's the mainstream product, but it allows assistive technology to be plugged into it. Although in this, I would say it is very close to being a product along with the whole system being in place. So the assistive technology itself is very low component. Okay, so I'll take up two more examples of universal design to just to bring in that point of what we really mean. So first example I would say of WhatsApp. Now, um, the WhatsApp actually is a communication, written communication app for all of us. Now, obviously, a person with blindness would need to communicate with the rest of the world, and the most likely the family, friends, colleagues are not persons with disabilities themselves. And so, uh, uh, if we had a separate solution for communication or for written communication for the blind, then this communication with the rest of the society would have become impossible. Whereas now, the communication is happening on that same app with the rest of the world. And what has actually been done is that so every app, every communication cap which is there on smartphone is not accessible. Let me tell you also that. A clear example being that a lot of persons with blindness are not able to operate Telegram. This is another very popular app for written communication. A lot of persons with blindness are facing a lot of difficulties, especially with the Telegram app on the iOS devices, which is otherwise considered to be a notch above everything else, especially when it comes to accessibility also. The Apple devices are considered to be much better than any other assistive technology device. However, when it comes to Telegram app, it is actually not um, usable, and some of the operations actually cannot be performed by the screen reading software users on that. Whereas on WhatsApp, design considerations have actually been given that even when you go there for typing, even when there are um, the emojis which are not textual elements, even those are labeled beautifully, and persons with blindness are able to actually make out whether it is uh, laughing face or a smiling face or a frowning face, and all those kind of expressions are actually mentioned when any emoji comes in. There also, one of the key elements here that I would like to bring in into universal design is that although the interface of WhatsApp has been completely made accessible, and the devices on which it is running is also made accessible, completely accessible, that is, their designs are accessible. Yet, when we still face inaccessibility because a lot of people would actually put content in there, which is you know, text in form of images. Now, obviously, no screen reading technology would be able to, straight away derive the text out of images and start reading them out. Although there are now OCR technologies which are coming in, but obviously they will not work in all languages, and it's a very, very cumbersome process for converting every image that you receive on WhatsApp to try to convert. I think that level of sensitivity would have to come. But that brings in another key principle of universal design and accessibility, actually. I would not even say universal design, but primarily of accessibility, which is that the accessibility is like a circuit, like it's like a electric circuit. Even a smallest gap in that circuit breaks the whole circuit, and the whole circuit is rendered useless. Um, I have actually mentioned here another example of Kindle here, which actually gives a complete holistic solution. And it's a positive example that I've given in here of that universal design. Um, it wasn't accessible right from the word go. It wasn't accessible earlier. We had to fight a lot of huge legal and on the roads battles to make Kindle accessible. But at least that brought about a positive change, and the whole solution, the whole supply chain, which includes the accessibility of the content being provided through Kindle, the the interface where you go and purchase books, and the interface when you open that book and start reading it, all these components at every stage had to be made accessible. So it's not just one part that can be said, that we can't say that making books accessible, we just need EPUB books and with accessibility guidelines and things are done. No, the distribution mechanism, the reading mechanism, the hardware, software being used in this whole supply chain has to meet the accessibility requirements, and only then the accessibility really happens, and only then the universal design happens. So again, over here, this is an example of universal design, that um, the millions of books which are now available for us to go onto the store and purchase and start reading, they are not created specially for persons with disabilities. They are the same mainstream books. And I can give you an example that before Kindle was made accessible, for hundreds of years, sorry, I'm just slightly exaggerated there, not hundreds, but at least for 5, 6, 7 decades, a lot of emphasis has been made in making books accessible to the blind. But in whole of that effort, um, even in countries like USA, which were pumping in a lot of resources in this activity, only 4 to 5% of published materials could be made accessible. But now, when we talk about mainstream accessibility, when Kindle becomes accessible, suddenly that number and that percentage jumped to almost 60, 70%. So that's the difference that universal design makes. And if we talk about India, uh, you know, we have got something called Daisy Forum of India, which is a network of all the organizations which are trying to provide, services to persons with blindness or other print disabilities, and trying to provide books in accessible format to them. And there have been organizations in India since 1950s who have been running, uh, libraries of accessible format books. Yet, when we created a national repository of all the organizations put together, for which has been running since 2016, till date, the complete collection of books that all these organizations have put together, the total collection number has reached out to about 18,000 books, total of just about 18,000 books. Whereas through Kindle app today, through Kindle store, which is the mainstream store, suddenly the number of books which are available in accessible format, which I can actually just, even if I am ready to pay, earlier all the access that I had was just to these 18,000 titles. But with Kindle, I have access to 4 million titles. That's the difference that comes between special and a separate world versus mainstream becoming accessible. So that's a stark difference that you will see. And obviously, we can't run. I mean, it's economically not possible to recreate the whole world for acknowledging diversity. We cannot have separate train services or banks or schools, or although we had tried level best to at least create separate schools or separate libraries for blind, and it's been in a way a complete failure of a sort, because till the time we had separate schools for the blind, although we call them also blind schools. I mean, our schools itself became blind. A lot of them actually operate like a schools who are themselves blind. And when I say that, it means that the schools were not of that quality. They were not able to provide education of that quality. But till the time we had these schools for the blind as special institutions, would you imagine how much, what is the percentage of people who should have been in the school amongst persons with disabilities? How many of them actually were actually in the school? There were again just about 5% of them. That means 95% of the people who should have been in this educational environment, they were outside the school, outside the schooling environment. Today also, after we said that now we have state policy of inclusive education, which means that no mainstream school can deny admission to any child on the basis of disability. and it's the responsibility of the institution to provide all services and to make take care of this diversity in the classroom. Now we have been able to get about 48 to 50% of children in the schools who should be in the schools. So we are still a lot of ground to cover, but yes, still there is a significant positive movement there. At this point, I'll just bring in another video just to show that when we talk about technology, when we talk about these, like I said, Kindle is accessible. So what do we really mean by accessible there? And this is one part which we say that a book, we should be able to read a book with eyes, ears, or fingers. We should be able to read a book in so many different ways. And this is what is happening to things like Kindle and books from Sugandha Pustakalaya and Bookshare and all these collection of books in accessible format that we get in our hands. We are able to read them with eyes, ears, and fingers. And what it really means, let's just have a look at that. Um,
Hello everybody, I'm Dipendra Monocha, Director Developing Countries Program DAISY Consortium, Founder Trustee Saksham. After several decades of work, it is now possible for persons with print disabilities to be able to read with either eyes, ears or fingers in Indian languages and with affordable cost. When there is any kind of sight loss or low vision or blindness, the biggest problem that comes is that we are not able to read normal print. This now becomes possible to read all the books when we have digital technology or the accessible books in digital format. For example, what do we mean by reading with eyes, ears and fingers on a digital book? If there is a person with low vision and if I have a smartphone or a laptop, I can actually increase the size of the text on the screen to any level that is suitable for me. I can also change the color contrast, I can change the line spacing, word spacing, and that would make it suitable for any kind of eye condition, and I'll be able to read that book very easily with my eyes. Reading with ears means that the same digital text can actually be read out to me using the text-to-speech technology. The computer's voice or the mobile phone's own voice will read the whole text out to me and I can listen to it. Reading with fingers means that there is a refreshable braille display which is connected to either my mobile phone or a computer, and I can start reading the same digital text which is shown on the screen of this computer or a mobile phone with my fingers on this refreshable braille display. There are almost 50 lakh books which are now available which can be read with eyes, ears or fingers. And the best part is that the technology required to read these books is now available at a very affordable cost. A smartphone could just cost about 10,000 Indian rupees or just about 120 US dollars, whereas a refreshable braille.
So I'm just stopping this video in between. Okay, so now when we are seeing this part, I mean, you've just seen that various kinds of adjustments in text which are required. And this is right now we are talking just about persons with blindness and low vision. Obviously, there are requirements for people who cannot hear, or requirement for people who have intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities. So each of these this diversity would need certain accommodations, and we are talking here about just the text. Taken up this example of just the text here. So some of the requirements, user requirements, when it comes to it, is that how do we make sure that I am able to, if I'm reading a book, to navigate to certain parts. So if I have to jump to chapter 5, I should be able to go to chapter 5 and start reading for it. Or if I'm sitting in a classroom and teacher says jump to chapter 30, the page 30, and today we are going to read a paragraph on that. So this navigation facility is required in this digital book. We may need to change color contrast, special navigation requirement, math equations, or line spacing or word spacing or color highlighting, and those kind of things are specific requirements. Learning disability, persons with learning disabilities, highlighting of the focused word or sentence which is being read out, both text actually being read out and displayed, and there's a synchronization which is happening, and the highlighting of it which is happening. Or you could even have a requirement that one sentence at a time should be displayed on the screen. But for persons with intellectual disabilities, we may need books which are there in simplified language, or commonly called as easy to read version of a book. So there are so many different requirements, and when we say easy to read version, means that there are color combinations, illustrations which are required, which are inserted in this version. You use color very effectively to differentiate between different elements of a book, and so on and so forth. So so these are, I've just captured a few requirements which are there when we talk about a universal book, and a book with universal design principles. Now, how do we translate that into the actual implementation? So if we capture all this, what we do is, so today what is happening is, for navigation to different chapters, what we do is that we mark headings of chapter headings with the heading styles. So if you imagine a Word document, so there are heading styles there, and one of these styles are heading 1 style. So we would apply this heading 1 style on all the chapter headings. And in the subsections, the subsection headings, we would apply heading level 2 style there. We would also say that we have to negotiate with screen reading software in a data presented in a tabular form. So this proper table markup needs to be there. The markup is a terminology that I'm using for coming from HTML version. But yes, when you talk of Microsoft Word, we should use proper insert table feature of Microsoft Word to create tables, and not by aligning text of various rows by using tabs or space bars. That would not really, visually it may look like a table, but that will not be acknowledged as a table by the computer. So use appropriate insert table facilities to create tables, list, or footnotes, for example. So there is a special feature in Microsoft Word to create footnotes, or there is terminology, special markups available in HTML to insert footnotes, or in EPUB format. There are these tags which have been created for these various elements of books, and we would use these along with adding alternative text to images. So if there is an image, we would provide text that describes that image in a summary. Like the photograph that was there in my first slide, there is an alternative text that described that there is a girl with blindness sitting with a laptop in a mainstream classroom. So this was a description which was given to that picture, and that is how I could make out what is the picture that is currently being displayed on the screen for the rest of the people to see. So these are now I would say technical instructions created to meet those requirements which were mentioned in the previous slide. So this is the transition that has happened, that first we capture the requirements, then we convert them into how to actually meet those requirements in our technical work. But if you see this issue, what happened? What is really happening? If you are a content creator, you would start feeling a headache in your brain, completely thinking that how many requirements am I going to look about? I mean, I have just to create a single PowerPoint presentation. I mean, am I going to first of all check out how many different diversities are there and what all are their requirements? Am I meeting all the requirements or not? How do I do all that? And how do I learn about all these technical things that are mentioned here in this slide? So that is where the next step comes in. That all these requirements lead to the technical specifications, and these technical specifications are compiled in the form of standards or guidelines, and these are published standards and guidelines. um, Example of the most common example is web content accessibility guidelines. Um, there are EPUB accessibility guidelines for content in for digital text. First of all, for creating digital text which is interoperable and usable in the whole world, we created EPUB, and then we added EPUB accessibility guidelines to make sure that all those user requirements and specifications are actually part of this whole system. So, these standards are, play a huge role, because all that now this content producer has to do is to say that, okay, if I'm creating a web page, I must comply to web content accessibility guidelines. And then it's not just that these standards and guidelines have been issued, there are validation tools also available with this. So if you create a web page, you run a validator for web content accessibility guidelines. Or if you're creating a Word document, you run a Word accessibility checker. And that checker, that thing will actually tell you where all is the accessibility broken. And this is all happening because a lot of effort has gone in capturing all those requirements, converting them into solutions, what would actually solve it, and then creating these tools to validate whether your product actually complies to those accessibility standards or not. Standards also have a huge role to play um, in terms of the universal design, because over here we are not talking just about products or documents or solutions being created specially for persons with disabilities. Again, we must remember we are talking here about universal design. There is no shortcut to universal design. And I have left this slide blank by design, not by mistake, because I've put in a question there. When to think about these standards? Are these to be, so when do we say that the requirements are there for persons with blindness in terms of educational institution? The educational institution must be accessible for persons with disabilities. Do we need to think about it when we are creating a special school for the blind, or do we need to think about it when we are designing every school? Answer in after my talk, I hope, is very obvious, that we need to think about it for everything. It can't be for applied. These standards are not designed to be applied only on special products. These standards are for mainstream products. These standards have to be applied for all procurement. And when I use this word procurement, it's the key word of making our society accessible for all. Whatever is being procured, whatever is being created, these standards on accessibility have to be applied to it. That is how the procurement agent or a procurement officer is going to understand what is accessible. Our law, the Persons with Disabilities Act, Right to Persons with Disabilities Act, clearly says that all the websites, all the office equipment, all the IT infrastructure which is being placed in banks or any public office or even private office has to be accessible for all. How do you define what is accessibility? How would an officer sitting in a bank know that whether my software that's the banking software that is getting deployed, that I'm purchasing for my bank, whether that is actually accessible or not? So the only thing which is to be said there is that the software, the supplier, Mr. Supplier, when you have to supply this software to me, please make sure that it meets the web content accessibility guidelines or on any of those accessibility standards that apply to that particular product. So there are so the rules for procurement have to clearly mention that for each of those products, how does it meet accessibility? Which are those standards that apply to different types of products, which will ensure accessibility? That is what why I'm mentioning here is we are still in that transition phase right now. In our country, we do have the act in place which says that things have to be accessible. Yet we are in the process right now to even define the various standards for accessibility. So where are we in this in terms of standards? Who creates these standards? So there is a whole structure, there is a whole flow of how things are happening. If you know about the legal systems also, there are international model laws that get created. There are international laws, and as a country, we go and sign and ratify those international laws. And when we ratify those laws, we declare to the world that the laws, these all the provisions of those international laws will be applicable in our own country, and our laws will comply to that international law. So so there is this Child Right Convention, which says that the rights of the children uh, is to be ensured. And so there are now similar laws, the Indian laws which are related to child rights would actually comply with that international law. When it comes to disability, there's UN conventions on the rights of persons with disabilities. So earlier we had a law for persons with disabilities in 1995, and then we ratified the UN Convention in 2006, and it took right to Rights for Persons with Disabilities Act that came uh, in 2016 finally, that now makes our disability law completely compliant to the UNCRPD. Similar kind of infrastructure is there for the standards also. So there are ISO standards, which are international standards, and then there are a lot of accessibility standards which are part of these ISO standards, and then we say that okay, within India we would or within our own country we would create standards which are compliant to those international standards, or we would pick up those international standards and see which of those standards have to be modified to meet our requirements. If there is need for any kind of modification, which is essential to be done for it, we would make those adjustments and create an Indian standard which is compliant to it. But the more preferable path there is that if there are specific requirements for our particular language, for example, or our requirements, then we should contribute to that international standard and make it completely inclusive standards for the world. And why I'm mentioning this is that being in the space of standards, because DAISY consortiums, where I come from, DAISY consortium's main task is to create standards for digital books. We created standards for digital books for persons with blindness, but we were the first persons with blindness were first users of digital books. So the standards that were created for persons with blindness got adopted by the mainstream industry. So we ended up creating these book standards for digital books for the entire digital book industry. So we are into this standards process, and what we have seen that the participation of Indian technical community in the international standards is very, very, very low. we are very weak when it comes to standardizations or participation in these standards. And why I'm mentioning this is here is that it's a very big opportunity or a career path to get into this realm of standards. We are suffering because of the lack of our capabilities in this domain, because we are not able to bring together those standards. You'll be surprised when for this procurement policy, if we are saying that we need to create standards here, we need to adopt standards, because how do we define accessibility otherwise in our procurement policy? Our, our policy and our law is clearly saying that yes, whatever we procure has to be accessible. But obviously, there is a need for defining standards. But the kind of discussion which is going on what standards to apply, you would say that we are almost like infants in the area of standards in this country. We are not studying international standards. We are not knowing that what already exists in international standards, and we start by trying to reinvent the whole wheel here. Whereas what we should be doing is to pick up the international standards, make sure that our requirements are met in that thing, participate in very actively in those international standards organizations like the World Wide Consortium or the DAISY Consortium. DAISY Consortium, of course, there is sufficient participation from India, and we are making sure. But when it came to International Digital Publishers Forum, the W3C, the participation, I'm actually giving you a thing from my personal experience, the participation from India can at best be described as very weak. And I think we need to strengthen this aspect, because otherwise, till we remain weak in this part, the accessibility and the universal design will only remain a dream. We can only keep harping about it, that this is what we need, but how to achieve it will always remain a dream, because we need to plug this huge gap. We need to understand this whole game of standards. We need to understand how it applies to the procurement, and we need to acknowledge that yes, there is diversity. We need to acknowledge that universal design is the answer, and this is the universal design can be achieved by very actively participating and following the standards of the industry. So a few references here. You can always get back to me if there are any doubts, anything, any resources required. I'll be happy to talk to anybody when it comes to strengthening this aspect of ours in way of participation in the standards. Thank you so much for the patient listening, and I hope this would have met your, tickled your mind a bit in terms of this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monocha, for a wonderful talk, very useful insights into universal design, issues of accessibility, and how we can mainstream design to ensure we end up with something that's much more accessible in our societies. Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. I'll invite you to post your questions in the chat window, or if you have any issues, you can raise your hand and we'll enable the video for you and you can ask your questions. So, Mr. Monocha, there's one question from Supriya Day. She asked, Sir, what are your thoughts on including universal design principles right from school or college education, and how can we achieve that?
So yes, I mean, universal design actually applies to each and every aspect of our lives, and certainly for schools, that's the best place to start, because that is where the foundations are being laid for the future generation. And the classroom has to be made completely inclusive, and these universal design principles will need to be sort of applied for it. I think that there is a scope of, as I said, the scope of a lot of research. We need to pick up those standards, like the building standards are there, the content standards are there, and you need to apply, you need to gather all those standards which will make that part accessible, and then do our sufficient research uh, to to define it in a language which is understandable in our country. I think that's a work of especially the work, institutions like Vision Empower, that we need to put such kind of documents in place which are understood in India by people, by common people, which connect to the universal practices.
Thank you. There is a follow-up question by Shagun Bajpayee, which is very similar. He says, while we talk about assistive technology being more affordable now, how much of it is being absorbed by mainstream education? And what, according to you, are the main barriers when it comes to an inclusive classroom?
So assistive technology being made accessible and compatible with Indian languages, especially if I talk about persons with blindness, it's not very long time ago that it became that way. So it was as late as 2018 that we got the technology that I shared in the video of reading with eyes, ears, and fingers, which are compatible with Indian languages and this thing. So, but then it is not yet part of day-to-day lives of people. Although it's adaptation which is happening, we are making all our efforts. In fact, 2018 I observe as a year as a complete change of approach year, because before that our whole of our concentration was on creating solutions, filling up those technology gaps. From then on, our main concentration is to take these technology solutions to people, how to make it, and there's a full change management which is required. It's not that you will create something today, even if it is a revolutionary thing, it won't get adopted by people just like that. People are not just sitting there waiting to grab things out. You will need to sort of, we will need to manage this whole change, because teachers are habitual of teaching in a way, schools infrastructure has been created for decades in a way, uh, students have become habitual of you know doing something. Small example, I mean, every there are universities which have given computers to each and every person with blindness. They can read and write themselves now. They are able to type completely. There's no problem in doing that. I've been doing it for past 25 years now. Yet when it comes to giving examinations, everybody is still writing their examinations using scribes. So why? Because first of all, they have to learn to be able to type, at the speed of at least 40 words per minute. They have to put in that level of effort. There have to be teachers who have to be aware that yes, this technology exists, and they don't have to now spend time in arranging for writers. Rather, start expecting them or start training their people that okay, now pick the skill up. Now you can write yourself, and start expecting them to submit their assignment like everybody else. That change hasn't happened. So it's a full change management thing that needs to be sort of thing, besides dealing with all the normal things that we think about, that there will be people who will still not be afforded, so you have to subsidize it, you have to make things available, you have to make further improvements, you have to provide after sales support, and all those kind of support mechanism has to be put in place. All those things are still there, but I would still say bigger than all that is this change management and awareness and trainings and all those kind of components that go into it.
There is a question from Saksham. How do we contextualize the international standards to meet our Indian or local needs?
So, only one way, that we have to participate in these standards creation activities. I mean, we have to be part of W3C's various committees to be able to influence. I mean, there is participation happening, but it is not a strong participation, and we are not being able to contribute to that level as we should. And I think our technical institutes really need to play a huge role in building this capacity within the country to be able to do that. We also need to be aware of these standards and obviously know what is already done, so that we are not recreating uh, everything which is already there. So we have to obviously uh, read those, see what is applicable, what is not applicable, what is the part in those standards which are missing that is required, and then contribute back to that. So I think there's a whole cycle to it, and definitely these need to be done. I mean, a clear example was that we are in the process of providing guidelines for our education portal, Diksha portal, and the experts group that got together, we almost started to rewrite WCAG. I mean, WCAG has been there for such a long time, and all the group almost restarted doing it, and then suddenly we found that everything is written, and what was required was to go through this WCAG and see what is missing in it. I mean, that's where our concentration has to be, to contextualize it.
There's a question from a deaf person in the audience.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. I am happy to be in this webinar, and I would also like to understand deaf related technology solutions. Have you been working anywhere closely on deriving solutions for the deaf?
I have been associated with several groups since we as part of DAISY Consortium and as part of the Universal Books design process. We've interacted with institutions which are doing an absolutely wonderful job in terms of technology, even for persons with hearing impairment. Obviously, we are the biggest issue here is sign language, and we need conversions, we need translation. Um, so it's a language, it's a separate language in itself. So we need this translation into several sign languages which are there, and the non-sign languages that we use. So right now also we have an live interpreter. Whereas in terms of blindness, for example, now I do not need a human being to read things out to me. That's the device itself is reading things out to me. Now, this is what we want to achieve. I'm sorry for interpreters. I don't want to take away your jobs, but end of the day, we all know that technology has to move, have to step in, and it's the our devices will need to start
But the
translating.
deaf person says he's happy with having interpreters.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, obviously this is the biggest luxury that we can have. Like even for persons with blindness, it's always a luxury to have a human being read out things to you. But I mean, as I'm saying, the real inclusion will happen when somebody is speaking, and we don't need a third person in between, and the technology has stepped up to for a seamless communication happening between person with hearing loss and with the normal language, the mainstream language speakers. We are moving ahead in that. I've seen a lot of efforts. These avatars are being created, which will synthesize this whole depiction of sign language digitally, and the translation systems getting strengthened. Once these basic components, and there are a lot of basic research components that are required for it. It's not something that an app creator would be able to create. We need those basic building blocks to be able to address this problem. Uh, there is very deep research, and especially with artificial intelligence coming in, we have very, very high hope that in very, very recent times to come, we will have systems in place which will be able to handle these translations. In our country also, I think there are good research labs that should be trying to, create, spending time in this very, very basic research of creating signing avatars, or the language translation protocols, or the language translation systems between, say, Hindi and Indian Sign Language, or English and Indian Sign Language. I think those translations will need to be done um, based on basic engines. Once these basic building blocks are there will be several app creators which will be able to make use of those basic building blocks to give us solutions. Right now, when my experience is that we are, most of the educational institutions or the technical institutions, when they come up with proposals for persons with disabilities, we are not, very few proposals which talk about this basic research. There are enough of them which says that I will create sign language translation. But when we see the proposal, they're assuming as if all those building blocks already exist, which currently there are not. So obviously that project would fail and not give you the final results. I hope I'm making sense, because this is not a common language. I think I'm talking more to the technical people today rather than the disability community.
I will definitely get in touch with you, and we'll see if we can work together.
Sure, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
So, Mr. Monocha, we have a few more questions. Shall we take them? There are about 3-4 more questions.
Yes, yes, please. No, sure.
Okay. So this question is from Dr. Manohar. He asks if there is data on the actual or even approximate number of children who are blind in India and the actual number who attend inclusive schools, and where can we source such a data from?
So obviously the reliable data which is there, last reliable data that we have is the census, which says 5.3 million persons with blindness and low vision in India. Um, uh, there are a lot of claims and anti-claims for it, because WHO's estimation is very, very way apart. So the latest WHO thing, which was again way back in, I think, 2014, if I'm not wrong, they estimated about 58 million against 5.3 million. So it's a big difference between these two um, so-called authentic, some way in authentic resources of data about persons with blindness and low vision. And Ministry of Education has complete list. I mean, because of this Education for All project, state-wise data is fully available in Ministry of Education about how many students there are in the inclusive setup, at least in the government setup. People who are there in the private schools, of course, those numbers are not yet available. But at least in government setup, those numbers are absolutely fully available.
So there's a question from Vikas. I'll slightly rephrase it. When you talk about universal, or when we're talking about universal design, do we compromise on the usability part?
No, so there's no scope of any compromise. So, as I said, universal design should try its best to be usable by all. Otherwise, it should make sure that it is usable by all by adding assistive technology. So that's the basic principle. So, I mean, like a software. I mean, when you are creating a website, the website itself doesn't speak, but it allows screen reading software to speak everything out. So that's where. So there is no compromise happening there actually.
There's a question from Nibin Paul Matthew. While there are a lot more discussion about accessibility guidelines for the web and also initiatives around that, in terms of physical infrastructure, we don't see a similar kind of push. So, are there any special initiatives, for example, the Smart Cities project, etc., where the physical infrastructure accessibility is also being talked about in as much with as much enthusiasm and fervor as the web accessibility?
No, actually, I would slightly disagree there because when the whole thing about accessibility started, first started with the physical accessibility. So if you see the history of it, I mean, I have been involved in this process since 1990s, and the whole decade, right from the international domain. Um, at UNSCAP level, I was involved with this Decade for Persons with Disabilities from 1993 to 2002, and the whole emphasis was on physical accessibility and all the guidelines, things, everything. So if you pick up that law that came about in 1995, they don't talk about information accessibility at that level at all, because at that time, whole discussion was all about built environment. And it was only in 2002 when the new decade started that information accessibility started getting traction. And you would have unified, universal built environment guidelines in place in India also. So there's and wherever and in smart cities thing, I know that there is a project going on in funded by DFID and there's National Institute for Urban Affairs, which is taking up projects on accessibility. I would say 90% or almost 80 to 85% of talk is all about built environment in those forums. So, so yes, there is, but where I would completely agree with you is that the implementation in both these areas is lacking. So we have we have put policies in place, we have put guidelines also in place, but the implementation, of course, the way it should have happened, the compliance, the way it should have happened, has not happened. But now we do have Rights to Persons with Disabilities Act. It gives a wonderful tool in our hands, and if we, I think now the role in our hands is it's something that please do not accept inaccessibility. That's what I would say. Please do not accept inaccessibility. If you go to a bank which is not accessible, sue them. I mean, that's how. I mean, that's what we need to do. I mean, if we allow, I mean, I think right now the situation is that we are allowing inaccessibility. So that is where things need to start changing. Once we start creating, uh, examples of how the implementation, how non-compliance is going to be not acceptable. That is those kind of examples need to be created.
So thank you. We'll take one last question because I know you've been talking for more than an hour now.
I can go on for days on
Not
this.
fair on our part to keep going on. So this question is from Akarsha. This is on tactile graphics. The question says, "Sir, what are your views on tactile graphics? Where do you see it in the future? What is your view on having tactile graphics beyond curriculum, for example, for storybooks or other recreational media?"
No, so I think this is a topic which is we need to again, that's a change management part that comes into tactile graphics. We have lived without tactile graphics, and as a result of it, we have almost lived without subjects like geography and science and mathematics and all these STEM education. So all these things will have to come in together. We have to start investing into our children first, so, because uh, if a person has already crossed their exam in school and college education, and if we give them tactile graphics, that won't work, because the habit of negotiating tactile graphics is not, those faculties are not developed, and often you will find rejection, a very strong rejection that will come from that age group, because they have not become habitual of it. So if you, I mean, it's not easy for a person after certain age to start negotiating maps. You create a tactile map of a particular building or particular area. Very few people will be able to understand and make head and tails out of it, because that faculty has not actually been developed. So you'll have to start from childhood. And future, of course, is not just tactile graphics, but also 3D models. I think we'll have to have a combination of both. 3D models, 3D printing of models have huge potential. It's definitely, I mean, if you can provide something in 3D, obviously it is better than 2D. So tactile graphics that way are more, they will be more affordable. Um, uh, so I mean, everybody doesn't study just from the globe. We obviously have atlases um, in form of 2D atlases and not just the globe that we study geography in, when we talk about mainstream. Similarly, we have to extend our 2D. Right now, we are just introducing tactile graphics, but in future, I think we'll have to strengthen even the 3D models ecosystem in this country for supporting our education and employability.
Thank you very much, Dipendraji, for the talk and uh, for taking all those questions. I see a few more questions, but unfortunately, we are kind of running out of time, and we'll not be able to offer Mr. Monocha a hot cup of coffee. So uh, we should not strain his vocal cords too much. May I request Dr. Swami Manohar of Microsoft Research, who is also a co-convener of CAGS, to propose a vote of thanks, please?
Thank you, Amit. It's my honor and privilege to thank Dipendra for his wonderful talk. First of all, to be agreeing to part of this webinar series. And I thank on behalf of myself as well as the Center for Accessibility in the Global South. And we would very much like your continued association to share your expertise. That'll really be a welcome, and we hope to have continued association with you. I would also like to thank our interpreters, Shurbi and Manisha, for excellent job, even though Dipendra was going really high speed and you were managing to catch up.
Yeah.
And I also like to thank all our participants for continuing to be with us going forward, and look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you. Over to you, back to you, Amit. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. This is a forum to engage, start conversations, and we will continue doing it every month. So thank you very much.